Ladies and gentlemen, good morning again. We are running short of time. Therefore, we probably use about an hour and 10 minutes instead of 1.5 hours. Let me tell you how I intend to conduct this session. I will make a very short presentation to set the stage, and then I will ask 2 questions to each of our distinguished speakers and try to get their answers and discuss, and then hopefully leave some time for you to ask questions if there are any. Let me just start saying that, as we all know, the 7 SDGs have a broad agenda which include productive capacity, inclusive growth, peaceful and inclusive societies, and tackling climate change and the way our societies produce and consume goods and services. Sustainable development goals will require massive new investments, not least in infrastructure. Stepping up investments in sustainable and resilient infrastructure could meet many other needs simultaneously, including by creating jobs and laying foundation for long-term development gains. The Sustainable Development Goals are applicable to all countries, regardless of their level of development. Now, when we look to G20, it seems that G20 countries have agreed on transformational change in countries at all income levels to ensure the prosperity is shared. So it seems that G20 and SDGs do have a common platform that we can base our discussions on. The G20 owes its existence to the realization that there are challenges which cannot be addressed by any one country alone. That's, again, a very important approach, which, again, in line with the SDGs that we are trying to touch on and work on it. So the big challenges like climate, like violent conflicts and security, refugee crises, they generate an unsettled global economy. The threat of contagious diseases and deadly natural disasters need collective action. The G20 can help generate and resolve this problem and help SDG. G20 leadership and engagement with the SDGs is vital. In our interconnected world, ongoing and effective coordination by the G20 of the world's largest economies should provide the context within which the 2030 agenda can be achieved. What we are going to do at this session, we are going first ask this question: does the G20 current action agenda support the adoption and implementation of SDGs? So that's what we will try to do. Therefore, I will start with Adolf, Mr. Lesch. My first questions to you is that G20 have taken some actions so far for the existing problems. Could you give it the picture regarding to that, to their actions? And please touch upon, do these actions cover and help to implement SDGs?
Many, many thanks. Also, thank you all for inviting me here to Istanbul. It's great to be back to the country and to the city. Let me make 3 very brief preliminary remarks because that is important to understand and keep in mind. The first is, it cannot be said often enough that the SDGs constitute sort of a Copernican turn in the thinking about development and cooperation. We move from a poverty and aid-centric system to a system that should be centered around the notion of sustainable development and transformative international cooperation. There's new purpose, new target groups, new means of implementation. I will not go to details. Second, there is a huge challenge of institutional path dependencies. The present architecture is not made for the SDGs, and Arma has made this point very eloquently. And there are two ways or two behaviors we can observe. There is a group of actors, countries, whoever, who tend to take the SDGs as a reassurance what they have been doing over decades, and just a call to try harder. That is more or less the traditional aid community. They embrace the SDGs as a follower of the MDGs, but that's not up to the challenge. That's not enough. And then we have a second type of institutions and actors. They tend to deny responsibility in one way or the other. That's United Nations, not G20. Or that's about developing countries, but not about internal policies in the EU. That's about wishful thinking, but not about the real stuff. So there is a lot of tendency to avoid to get into that business and to change course. But both groups are harmful in their behavior to the achievement of the SDGs. Both groups have to change fundamentally. And this is also quite interesting if you take a look at the means of implementation, and that brings me now to the G20. If you look at the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, or also at the Summit Declaration from September, when these documents talk about means of implementation, they mainly talk about implementation in low-income countries and means of implementation that are to help the low-income countries in implementing that. They do rightly so. That is a very important thing. And there's even the need to significantly scale up this. But at the same time, the fact there is only little talk about middle-income countries and almost no talk about implementation in rich countries, and no talk about changing the way rich countries interact with each other, a huge area of means of implementation is left unchallenged, and there's a risk that the business as usual goes on. For example, the TTIP or the Trans-Pacific Partnership. These are huge trade agreements. I'm not arguing whether they are useful or not. My point here is, do they help with the implementation of the SDGs? If we talk about trade only in a way that brings low-income countries to the global trading system, that's fine, that's nice. But at the same time, we need to change the trading system that is at the core of the economic cooperation of the richer countries. So there is a huge risk that we lose sight of the areas of implementation that are most critical to achieving the SDGs. Third comment on the G20. It is a quite young institution at leaders level, or institution or process, a high level of informality and therefore flexibility. That is a huge advantage. And in a way, the fact that the G20 meet at leaders level is a breaking free of traditional and institutional past dependencies. That is not countries meeting as blocks, as the North or the South and the BRICS and the G. No. Countries talk to each other at eye level, and alliances may change over time and depending on topic. So G20 in a way are better suited to address the challenges of the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Agenda than other institutions that are more stuck in the traditional thinking. So therefore I'm looking forward to the G20 to be helpful with that. So when it comes to the specifics, the Brisbane Summit made it clear that G20 leaders declared we support efforts in the United Nations to agree an ambitious post-2015 development agenda. And they stressed that they would like to contribute by strengthening economic growth and resilience. At least there is a vague commitment. Now we need to see the specifics in the next months and years. And if you take a look at the activities of the G20, there is almost no SDG without a G20 activity related to it. And there obviously are G20 activities not explicitly covered by the SDGs. And G20 activities relate to the 2030 agenda at the goals and targets level, but also at the level of means of implementation, and last but not least, at the monitoring and review level. All three areas are covered in one way or the other by the G20. And when you take a look, you would see a lot in the G20 work on energy, on growth, and infrastructure and innovation. So the goals 7, 8, and 9, I'm doing my best to learn them by heart. With every meeting I get better. So a lot of work on these core economic topics. Some work on poverty, on hunger, on health, on education, on gender and inequality at times. Little on water, cities, consumption and production patterns, more or less nothing. Climate, you can see it this way or there. I would say little on climate, oceans, little on terrestrial ecosystems, and also little on peaceful and inclusive societies, although there are some activities, for example, on corruption. If you take a closer look, an even more mixed picture emerges. Some of the G20 activities are geared towards domestic implementation in the G20 countries, rightly so. Some towards implementation in non-G20 or low-income countries. Some at the international and global public goods level, and some, and that is interesting, some G20 activities have explicit, quantified, and time-bound targets, something others can learn from. And these are, in very few instances, even more ambitious, as you can find with the SDGs. The one is a growth target. There's a target to add 2 percentage points of growth. There's no quantified growth target in the SDGs. There is a target, and it's time-bound. Then there's an interesting target of reducing the gender gap in the G20 countries by 25% by 2025, bringing 100 million women into work, into jobs. And there is a commitment to reduce the remittances costs to 5%, also quantified, time-bound target. And as I learned from the media, Antalya is to commit to increase youth employment, not unemployment, youth employment by 15% by 2050. That is also quite an ambitious target that goes beyond the targets encapsulated within the SDGs. So there is something, but in most instances, G20 commitments are less specific, less ambitious compared to the SDGs. And when it comes to the means of implementation, there's a lot of G20 activities in various fields: financial inclusion, remittances, energy technology, fuel subsidies, corruption, ODA, climate finance, trade, aid for trade. Some are ambitious, some vague, seldom quantified and time-bound. But with the monitoring and review mechanisms in place within the G20, there's a very good starting point that could connect G20 work to the SDGs? So your other question was, do these actions help to implement?
I think
we stop here.
We'll
Okay.
stop here. Later on, I'll come back to you. Thank you very much. You have set up a very, very interesting platform for us to discuss further. I should mention that now we have to look the civil society, the business community, and to universities in G20 countries who can contribute. That's my feeling to our 17 agenda, SDGs. Therefore, I will ask Mr. Erimez a question on civil society perspective. Considering the think tank capability in G20 countries, what could be the collaborating mechanism to develop collective solutions for implementing SDGs, and what will be the role of G20 governments to encourage this cooperation?
First of all, I would like to thank you for just being part of this panel discussion. Actually, I just added to the panel. Let me introduce myself. My name is Erkin Erimez. I am the member of board of the UN SDSN Turkey, and also I'm a consultant in Arıkan Consulting. This company is the knowledge partner of B20 process in governance and sustainability theme. We prepared the report for this, and our recommendations will be included in the final recommendation letter to the G20. And also I am a member of academic board of Arıkan Governance Academy, which is a non-profit academy, mainly working on the governance issues with a very selected members of an advisory board. So let me tell you about what will be the role of the civil society, think tanks, and universities. First of all, I can say that think tanks have a unique capability, which they may have, in some of them especially, have both academic and also the practical knowledge, so they can bring all these knowledge together to find a collective solution for the issue. Academics have purely academic view. Sometimes it could be too theoretical to implement. However, when those two issues bring together, you could find solutions, and so that could be a big platform to bring together from different perspectives of people from universities, business, government, and discuss the issues to find a solution where everybody could be part of it and accept it. The second issue is that universities are really critical because universities are just spreading the knowledge and also innovating, especially in the technical and even social terms. So bringing this know-how to the business and the government will help the implementation of these goals. Actually, I know that UN SDSN have started some initiatives, maybe from India, starting from India, especially all these online education training systems to spread this knowledge and educate people to achieving these goals. And one more thing I would like to say, civil society is also very important because all these actions will affect people in the society. If you have a strong civil society organizations system, then people will be easily participate this process. I can say that, for instance, I consider OECD in some kind of a think tank capability. And when you look, and during this Paris meeting, we had a workshop where the head of regulatory department, Nick Malishev, attended our meeting as a panelist. What he said is really important. Actually, OECD, when you look at the OECD's documents and recommendations, you can see that this inclusive and participatory mechanisms already defined in all these documentation. But the implementation by the government is limited. When you look at all these documents, you could see that civil society's participation to especially regulation making or maybe policy development process improves the quality of the all these regulations and policies, and also it makes easier them to understand the impacts, like by making impact assessment analysis before and after the implementation. And ILO, International Labour Organization, behaves in some manner as also a think tank because they are making researches on what will be the case for the labor issues in the future. What are the current trends, what are changing trends from today to future. During that B20 process, I also attend some meetings organized by the ILO. What I see is that the workforce issue is a critical issue. Now the workforce needs changes, people's needs changes, so we need to find new policies, we need to develop new policies to keep people motivated for the future employment processes. When you look at, for instance, the length of employment, it is just less than 2 to 3 years currently. And actually, the policies we have in our hand is just old ones where we would like to keep these people at least 10 to 20 years in an organization, which doesn't fit the current needs of the population. So we need to work hard on these issues, and think tanks, civil societies are critical, and universities are critical to find solutions and make researches to understand the root causes of these changes. And the governments need to bring all these institutions together with the business to find an applicable solution for these problems.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, you have already stressed that universities are an important player, could be an important player there. I shall ask Professor Akgiray. The 17 SDGs has been developed to improve quality of life in the next 15 years. Educating people is critical to implement these SDGs. What could be the role of G20 education institutions, particularly universities, in encouraging people and societies to take action?
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Probably in this room I'm the least informed person about sustainability, particularly on what the UN SDG community. So my apologies in advance. And whatever I say will be either very wrong or very right. It can't be in the middle. I mean, I read some papers and some documentation, and this in the morning, listening to Professor Sachs from your talk particularly, I got the picture, so to speak. Now, I've been in the financial world. I've been a professor of finance for almost 30 years. So I was 10 when I became a professor. And then I've been a financial regulator for a number of years. So all the meetings of this type that I've attended locally and internationally, ranging from academic meetings to Financial Stability Board, IOSCO, and organizations like this, it was all about finance. And I don't remember any instance where the word sustainability or poverty or income distribution or gender equality was mentioned in those meetings. So it is not in the agenda of the financial community, so to speak. This is important because, as they say, I mean, it will be a street term, but money talks and the others walk, basically. So if you don't give money to bad projects, those projects will not be. That's as simple as that. So that's what maybe we should focus on. And my uninformed criticism of this community would be that there's everything in it. I mean, the UN SDGs is like the UN itself. I mean, all the things, and nobody can argue against them. So maybe an 18th item is due, which should be about the coordination and practical implementation of those 17 items. I mean, that's either you lead country by country or topic by topic. I mean, you have to go into specific. In the universities, what universities can do, this is one of the things we can do, host events like this, obviously. Now, I've been involved with two research centers in our university in projects on corporate governance, responsible investment, and more recently on sustainability. Just last couple of years, not earlier. And we are doing work with OECD and IFC and institutions like that. Research work and report writing work. Last 6 months, we've offered 2 courses to the industry on sustainability, ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues. But they were more focused on engineering part of it, that is environmental impact assessment and things like that, measurement part, and the financial part. Because recently, I mean last maybe decade, but with an increasing intensity in recent years, it is more difficult to find financing for sustainably bad projects. They don't give you the money anyway, at least directly. Of course, they always look for indirect ways. And I'm responsible also for training financial engineers who find the money for projects which destroy the earth or wreck the earth. So that's a sin that I have to confess for. But then we focused on specific issues, I mean specific topics. And as early as last week, we had a meeting about whether we should have a master's degree program in sustainable finance. That's it, nothing else, just sustainable finance. It's not like a track under an MBA or MS program, it's a program by itself. We have to do that because everything being discussed here is perfect. I mean, as a human being, you can't argue against that. But then how do we do that? That's the thing. So maybe we should share the task and do it piece by piece. Academia can be involved in teaching, obviously, which is very, very important. And most of our clients in those trainings were financial institutions, banks. They want to learn about those issues. That's good. That's good. But then to be practical, I mean, since I'm an academician, so I'm free to talk any nonsense that's possible. It's not a training. It should not appear to be like a training in ethics or morality. I mean, when we tell people you do this for your kids, for the coming generations, for the earth, everybody believes in that, but they don't do anything about it. It's always somebody that has to do it for me. It's either the government, local or national or international. Somebody else has to do it. It's not my responsibility. That's the end result. So the only way to change that is basically by force. By force, I don't mean regulation, laws and regulation. I mean some kind of a new contract between state regulation and Adam Smith's invisible hand. If you can get them together under one roof, I think that can be a perfect solution. I'll just mention an example in point, whether it makes sense or not, I don't know. Last week we had a training program in our university on PPP. PPP means public-private partnership. It's a model for doing business in the form of a partnership between the public sector and the private companies. Now, when we were going to training, the idea came to our mind. The public side, the government, the state, the lawmakers, the regulators must not be financial or business partners in such platforms. They should be engaged stakeholders to be watchdogs on issues that we are talking about today. Environmental, society, so on and so forth. Because if the state makes laws and regulations, they are often ineffective. It doesn't work. It certainly doesn't work in the financial industry. Believe me, you can make it illegal to give any money to a project which just cuts one branch of a tree. I mean, death penalty. Financial engineers will find a way of doing it in a legally okay way. You can't prevent that. Okay? So that, force through regulation doesn't work. Okay? But enforcing through being an active, engaged stakeholder in those projects. That is, if you don't do it this way, you know, you get a note in the meeting. You get a no. You can't make the decision. That's more effective. So maybe in the financial community, academic or industry, we should focus our attention, do more research in designing business models which are acceptable financially and which are also enforceable for the purpose of goals of sustainability. That's the only way. You cannot force banks to behave one way or the other. You cannot. But if you partner with them in some business, they have to be good with their partners. I think that's a soft approach. Your attempts, in my view, may be more successful. Okay. I mean, always it will be ideal to have a WTO of sustainability, but I mean, World Trade Organization, which have some international legally binding or somewhat legally binding rules to enforce. But we don't even have a WTO of finance. So when you say sustainability, you will get a big applaud, but no support, I think. So working indirectly as a smart businessman, as a smart stakeholder, especially on the public side, to educate and discipline the private sector, I think is the most effective way to go in today's complex environment, in my view. And universities can be active in producing at least 100 stupid ideas, but if one of them turns out to be good, that will be our contribution.
Now we will come to a second question. Mr. Lesch, what could be the action of G20 countries for SDGs that have not been covered with current action agenda? How this could be improved? Do we need a separate work stream like SDG20 or anything like that?
Thank you for this question and also for the very, very important comments made by the other panelists, and I will take it up and link it to the question. Obviously, it is impossible that everybody of us does everything. So what we need is an architecture in place that helps the individual actor to behave in the right way. And therefore also the G20 is quite important in that context, because the G20 set the stage. From that, very many work streams emerge and very specific jobs are taken up. So the mindset has to be right at the very outset, so to speak. And in your first question, there was also the notion, does the G20 activity help with the present SDGs? As I said, they help to a certain extent, but I would like to mention that they could also be harmful to the SDGs. For example, if you pursue the growth goal at the detriment of the environment or by increasing inequality. So you cannot take just one goal and go for it. You have to think of the others. And the second, and that is even more practical and related to the other interventions, there's a huge emphasis by G20 on infrastructure investment. It is necessary, rightly so, and it is necessary to frame it as investments in sustainable infrastructure. Otherwise, we will see what has been mentioned before, a lock-in in technologies that are not up to the challenge of the next decades. So the G20 is doing some positive things, but needs also to check whether all the present activities are conducive. So what should G20 leaders actually do? I think the answer would not be that the G20 at large is to cover all the 17 SDGs. That's the wrong way to proceed. And I would also say a proliferation of issues, today a little bit there, a little bit there, is not the way it goes. I think what is important to address the system of the G20 at a political level, at a governance level, and at an operational level. At a political level, there is still need for the group to commit as a group to the SDGs. They have agreed to the SDGs individually in New York. But to bring the SDGs into the G20 work streams requires a commitment by the leaders to implement them in their own countries, but also to implement them jointly in their global endeavors. And there are three leaders, three members of the G20 who followed the Swedish initiative to bring together world leaders to push for the SDGs. The Swedish did this initiative, and this is the President of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, the President of South Africa, Zuma, and the Chancellor of my own country, Merkel. And I do not know whether they will go to Antalya and say, well, we committed with the Swedish government to do at every instance campaigning for the SDG. But I hope they do, and they live up to what they committed in New York. So there is need to have a political commitment that is not sidelined to the development agenda of old. There's a huge risk if the first mentioning of the SDGs would be under the heading development and low-income countries. No, it should be at the very first paragraph of the declaration. I have not seen it. We cannot influence it probably, but at least we should say it. Secondly, the governance level. The governance means the institutional architecture of the G20. There are many work streams, but are these work streams and these institutions up to the new requirements? I would say not in every case. Take, for example, and that is your question, do we need SDG 20? There is a development working group. The development working group is dealing with development as it was framed by the MDGs, and it is helping low-income countries. You could change that development working group, change the mandate, change the configuration, and name it the Sustainable Development Working Group. So then it would become the center of the pursuing of the SDGs within the G20 system. But it cannot be sidelined into a silo so that we do SDGs and then we do finance and then we do trade. You need an umbrella framework that informs all work streams of the G20. Therefore, this changing governance within the G20 is important. So the G20 should decide that the SDGs inform all their endeavors, and they should set up a mechanism that makes sure that. And then it comes to the operational level. So the first two levels address more or less all SDGs. But operationally, the G20 need to focus where action by them is most pivotal and most needed. They should not do anything. And then we come back to the core mandate of the G20 around economic and finance. Yes.
Ask a question at this moment. You have rightly said that all okay, that's all.
No, the question, it is not that I saying they are not to approve it as a group, but it needs that they prove it as a group, that they embrace it. Because only by doing so, they would send a message to all their ministers, all their working groups and work streams to follow the SDG. So we have the same problem in the European Union. The European Union applauded and worked for the SDGs in New York. Now the real stuff comes to bring the SDGs to the internal policies of the European Union. And that's not easy. That's absolutely not easy to convince the President of the Commission that the SDGs should be the guiding constellation for the domestic work and economic policies. So when it comes to the operational level, I think they need to check what they are doing actually, whether that is commensurate and conducive to the SDGs, and then they should screen all SDGs, whether they could be helpful with them, and then set their priorities for action for them. And obviously, they should then act on priorities by mobilizing finance, working with others, and so forth. And this framework needs to be worked out over the next 12 to 18 months, something like that. So the Turkish presidency needs to kick it off, and then when the SDGs are formally in place from 1st of January, it is the Chinese to work on that. And I will not go into details because we are running out of time, but let me only say one point. There's a lot of engagement groups around the G20. There's a Business 20, B20, there's a think tank room, there's a Women 20, and. It would be good if the leaders would call on all these groups to take up the SDG agenda and help the G20 countries to promote it. So ask the think tank group, as they might ask us, to help with the implementation. Ask the business people to realign their way of doing business with the agenda. So political leadership is critical at this moment. We do not need the detail. We do not need the sectors for the moment. We need the basic commitment to follow this through. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I should have mentioned right at the beginning that we will look from the general perspective. That's what Mr. Lesch has put on the platform, and look into civil society, business, and universities. So let me ask the second question again to Erkin, and ask him the role of business and civil society in G20 countries in adoption and implementation of SDGs.
Actually, this is really important because business is part of this all these process. And when you look at these all 17 goals, you see that, as Mr. Sachs told, they are all interconnected in some manner. But during the B20 meeting in Ankara, there was a person from the Brookings Institute. What he said is that all these SDGs are really important, but the critical issue is that we need to change the mindset. Because we are thinking in the way we did before, but we are trying to find solutions for new problems. So this is a critical issue, and this is the case for business as well. And World Business Council, which I was part of before, actually working on how those goals could be translated to the business goals. And they worked on all these SDG Compass issue with UNGC and GRI to just operationalize how this could be transformed into the business life. But the critical issue is that for the business is the actually value-driven issue. So if you create value for your stakeholders, mainly shareholders, then that could be an area for investment. When it comes to investment, there is another big issue, because currently funds who is financing the businesses or investment companies do not care much about the sustainability issues, as Mr. Akgiray told. But it seems a little bit move on this side changing. For instance, CalPERS just added some performance indicators to its evaluating their workers, including sustainability issues from May 2015 onwards. So there seems a little bit change in the business institutions thinking, but it will take some time. The critical issue is that how these SDGs could be transformed into value for the business. This is the critical issue. But there is another trend in the world which is symbolized by the integrated reporting, integrated thinking. Because it seems that in the short term you can create value, but in the long term you distract value, and this distraction will cause your business to lose business itself. So now when it comes to this, I can see that the boards are the critical partners of this process. Why? Because actually management's perspective could be limited to short term, but boards need to consider that for the good of the business and the company, this company should survive forever. So this is a survival issue. So board's governance perspective, governing, directing, and monitoring perspective is really critical for just inclusion of business in all these SDG processes. And another issue is that now quality of life issue becomes more and more important for the government and for the business itself. And it has been just maybe materialized by the Stiglitz reports of 2008, where it just explained the quality of life issue in more detail, which also changed the views of the countries about the performance of GDP. Is this the real performance of the growth, or maybe the other issues need to be considered for success of the country, like income distribution, social issues, freedom of thought, freedom of speech, rule of law. All these are critical issues, and these are applicable to the business as well. And one thing adding to your point is that actually during the B20 process, what I see is that everybody is mainly focusing on its silo. That means anti-corruption group trying to find some recommendations to solve this bribery issue or anti-corruption issues, or maybe just government bids issues, but they are not incorrected. On the other side, another group like the infrastructure group trying to find solutions for themselves, which could be interconnected, but they are not, there is no much consultation on these issues. And I can say that all SDGs could be addressed in some manner with all these G20 processes, but they are not working too fast, actually, because when in Brisbane they decided to establish a global infrastructure hub where all these infrastructure bids will be listed and all the related parties could be able to participate with the knowledge. But this is not realized, and it seems it will take some time, some more time to realize that, because there are some issues, considerations of political considerations of some governments, I can say, maybe all of them maybe. So it's very difficult. And another issue from the business side, inclusiveness. Inclusiveness is critical for the social peace as well. Inclusiveness could realize in different manner. For instance, for low-income parts of the society, you could just create some kind of job. Or maybe for the SMEs, you could just take them into global value chains. So this will create some kind of fair distribution of wealth in the society. But all of these are new mindsets, and I think it will take some time to adapt in the business side, like in the government side. I hope in 2020, maybe we could be talking more positive things about all these issues from the business side.
Erkin, let me remind you that there will be a business session in the afternoon, and there will be some companies from Turkey will explain how they look and see the 17 SDGs. Thank you, Erkin, for your comments. Now, Professor Akgiray, you have mentioned how SDG can be successful, what the strategy that you have to follow so that they can be implemented, and you have said that universities have a very important, can have important role in that aspect. Well, now being a part of a university member, how do you see the collaboration between universities all around the world? I mean, obviously G20 is the major would be question, but we can say more for all universities, because that is going to be one of the challenge for SDSN. And at the moment, as I understand, we have about 300 universities already in the network. But how is that network is working? What could SDSN should do so that it can be successful with that, in that respect?
For us at Boğaziçi University in Turkey, we can do everything and almost everything. But I mean, as a very simple case, training, education, awareness, that's what we can do. I mean, you tell us to teach the industry a certain topic, and as Boğaziçi University, if we say we are doing it, I know many people will come to listen and learn from it. So that's one way. I mean, teach them this, we'll do that, and they will learn. That's easy, but universities should not be overstated. Because of the following thing, I mean, as Erkin mentioned, you can have a board of directors in a company of, let's say, X number of very good people, individually, highly ethical, highly knowledgeable, experienced, long-term view and everything, individually. But that when they get together, as a group, they can make the worst decision, the most unethical decision in the world. That's the curse of group work, maybe, or teamwork, I think. So G20 and EU and other groups are also like that. Plus, we should not read too much into G20 or EU, believe me, because think of G20, the total GDP of G20 members, if I'm not mistaken, makes up about 85% of the world's GDP. And more than 70% of the world trade. And more than half of those two numbers is US plus China. So basically G20 is G2 plus a few others. I mean, that's it. And I look at the table Professor Sachs showed us in the morning. US is competing with Turkey to be the number one from the end in the index list. And China is not even in the list because it's an OECD member. But even if they were, they wouldn't be in the list anyway. So, I mean, what value can you expect from a G20 endorsement? Would be nice, but I mean, that's all there is. I think my personal advice would be to work to the market players. I mean, train the markets, forget the governments. They won't do it. No politician, in his or her right mind, would argue against the SDG principles and walk, comfortably in public. But then they wouldn't do it individually or nationally. But G20 and EU can do it very nicely because nobody will be responsible at the end. And plus, in places like G20, if you walk through the right channels of decision making, I'm sure you can have them endorse almost anything. That's possible. Plus, from the presentation of Jeffrey in the morning, I got the impression that most of the positive developments we've seen over the last 20 years or so are not because governments and policymakers were good in SDG issues, because the world developed that way. And China became richer, so poverty came down globally because you're talking about 1.5 billion people. I think you have to break down, at the end of the day, today's world is 90% private sector economy, so I think we should work through the private sector, the market forces. Find some relative of Adam Smith and convince them of the nice thing about SDG. That would be more effective, because even if governments, all of them, endorse these things, it will have to go through the market anyway. So forget the governments, go through the market, I think. More practical, maybe.
Thank you. Let me, well, we have completed the discussion, but let me ask my friends here. I'll come back there. All right. Yes, please. Yes, please. Please.
It's a great discussion, and I wanted to enter it at a couple of points. First, what Professor Akgiray said about finance. There was a very interesting full page of the Financial Times yesterday on infrastructure financing. And it was interesting that the world's largest money managers were saying, we can't make this money move. We know that there's a big infrastructure gap, but we can't move it because we don't interface properly with the governments. This was in the United States in particular. So BlackRock, which has how many gazillion dollars under management. But they were talking about a real institutional failure. And basically, they couldn't do it on their own. There was no shortage of capital per se. But the model of how infrastructure would be financed, structured, and so forth was not adequate. And I think it is really our goal here. And it's like you said, this is a design problem. And we know that at some level, the money for all of this is there because as Guido has just finished a paper looking at what the potential incremental costs would be to move resources to close gaps. And it's maybe 2 to 3 percentage points of world GDP per year, $2 to $3 trillion per year, incremental, out of a $100 trillion world economy. So it's there. Of course, moving $2 or $3 trillion is not trivial, but on the other hand, it's also not fundamentally breaking the bank because it's 2 or 3% of GDP. Now, what stops this from moving? Of course, some of this is moving water uphill because it's against market forces. Or some of it is that there's no institutional mechanism to actually do this. Or with infrastructure, it's inevitably a public sector issue to a large extent because these are not typically merely market projects. They're big network projects that involve public policy choices, land use choices, regulatory environment, monopoly concessions, and so forth. So what I like about these goals is that they focus the attention on what should be done and they highlight the gaps of why it's not being done. It could be that the gaps are political or social or ignorance or lack of awareness, or it could be that it's solving a fairly complicated institutional set of problems, or some combination of all of those. And I do think that the role that you identified of having 100 solutions and one of them will work is a very good one. But doing that in a specific context, that it's not just an abstract problem solving, but a turkey problem solving, which is what are we doing here, whether it's the energy sector or transport or water management or the other issues, is really what we need to do. And yesterday I spent a couple of hours with a senior Wall Street person who was basically also saying, we don't know how to do this. We're traders. We know how to value assets. But building these structures, that's a little different. That's my idea of what good finance is, by the way, is not just valuing assets and trading, but actually building a new industry and getting the resources to it. So I just wanted to highlight that point. Second, 2 more quick points. Second point, the MDGs played a role in that poverty reduction. So it's not that it just happened. I watched it day by day for 15 years. Some things would have happened anyway. But it's amazing, even in China, where you wouldn't imagine that they'd even know what this is, by the way, because it's running 1.2 billion people. They were very conscious of the MDGs in certain areas. And ministers said to me, you know, that made it possible to put through this legislation because they were Millennium Development Goals. I was surprised, to be quite frank. Last week I was in Beijing. The Deputy Prime Minister spoke to a regional meeting of Asia-Pacific education ministers. She started her speech 15 minutes on the Sustainable Development Goals. These are China's goals. Again, I was very surprised. I didn't write the speech. So somebody in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs probably wrote her speech, but they take that as important in their messaging in Asia. Good sign. And not outside of my experience on this, that this makes some difference. And then specifically, I could mention many projects that were done at a scale of tens of hundreds of millions of people, disease control and so forth, that were directly the result of having these goals. So I wouldn't say it's all that the markets did it or not did it. It's a mix. Markets, without the markets, no way. Without the technology, impossible. But without the goals, lack of interest in certain sense. So that would be my second point. The third point on the G20 role. I do really agree with Adolf that the institutionalizing it in the G20 makes a difference, because what does the G20 really do? It meets once a year at the head of state level or head of government level, and then it makes assignments to the World Bank, OECD, IMF to do reports. Those reports actually become the work product. And so it's not that it's a complete shell to have a meeting once a year. It's actually, it is institutionalized, not as a G20, but in the assignments that are given out. And those are the only work products that get done, actually. And then they come back, they're reported, they're adopted, and so forth, and somehow the world stumbles forward this way. And if we could get goals into that process in a serious way, then those institutions would jump to attention and know that's what we mean. So in this sense, I really concur that the G20 isn't just 24, however many leaders coming together for a meeting, in which, by the way, they almost never discuss, well, that's not quite true, but they generally discuss security issues, which is really their favorite subject. But they do have sessions on all these other things. I've been to all of the meetings. And so they really do have an agenda, and they really do talk through economy and other things, even though what they really like to talk about is security. But the point, I would say, is that getting it onto the formal agenda actually moves things forward. So I just wanted to add that to the discussion.
Contributions. Let me ask to my friends here if you have any final comments so that we can go and get questions.
I'll just give a couple Jeffrey's arguments. I agree with them. He said it. The second point was better said than I could. That's what I meant, actually. Like, as of the end of last year, more than $21 trillion worth of assets under management have some kind of an SDG-related mandate, ethical, social, governance. So there's some good developments, and that's market-made. Probably through awareness raised by reports by OECD, World Bank, UN, and so forth. That's good. In China, the Shenzhen Stock Exchange, which is the biggest in terms of number of listed companies, but the third in terms of market cap, they had thousands of IPOs until last year. They have problems these days, obviously. But that was the process. This was the process they had. They had small companies. They trained them to become more institutional, more suitable for a public holding. And a good portion of the training, I know their training templates, is about sustainable growth and development in Shenzhen Stock Exchange. And out of those companies, I'm sure some superstars will pop out one day from China. The small technology startups mostly. And they are being trained in issues like financial reporting, corporate governance, and sustainability. In China, Shenzhen Stock Exchange. And it's the average age of the managers there is less than 30. So my generation type of thing. Okay, so these are good numbers. These are all you're doing. But these are all market forces. That's what I meant, basically.
Thank you. Last comment, probably.
Well, in the first place, G20 obviously is not obsolete. There's a lot of issues where G20 made a difference. So the issue is whether the G20 attaches its importance to an issue. And if it would not take it up, that would be a very, very bad message. Second point, when it comes to sustainable investments, and the point was made by Jeff, there is a gap in the institutions. There's some missing links that help this money move. And as I learned from participation in a Beijing meeting, there is talk of setting up a G20 Green Finance Task Force. And this initiative is supported by the People's Bank of China and the Bank of England. And they are dealing with this issue, how to move the financial system into the right directions. And obviously, as it is necessary with financial regulation in the old sense, you need some regulation, some incentives to look into these issues and to induce this change that is necessary. And a third point is, and Jeff mentioned the Chinese commitment to the SDGs. I think it is important that leaders not only to commit to act as a group, but also to commit individually. We all know that the summit declaration said that is not legally binding. It is voluntary to take part in the monitoring and review. G20 leaders could say, well, it's more voluntary, but we join the pack. We do it. And by doing so, setting an example. And we learned about China embracing the SDGs as sort of a guiding constellation for the next 5-year plan. I know from my country that the SDGs will be at the center of the new national sustainable development strategy. Why not have sort of a peer learning amongst the G20 countries on how to move forward the best way, and then report about the peer learning at the next leaders level meeting, so that leaders actually do not talk only about wars and security and terrorism, but also talk to each other, how did it work at home? So and that is my call, that they take it as an issue, they learn them there by heart and talk to each other about the best ways to steer that, because steerage leadership from the very top is the most critical with this.
No. Now we have spent 60 minutes, exactly. Now we can have 10 to 15 minutes if there are questions from you. Please. Well, everything seems very clearly explained. Right. Okay, thank you. Thank you, friends. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That's great. Yes.